Google wants to know as much information about you as possible, and they've made it clear that they've wanted to go further. They actually applied for a patent to equip smartphones with sensors that could detect environmental conditions like light and temperature to further personalized ads based on this. So for example, they could know if you're sitting in the baking hot sun, and then they could send you a personalized advert for a local ice cream van. They also patented a gaze tracking system, where whilst showing adverts, Google can see if people are actually looking at them. They can see where your pupils are facing, and even the dilation of them, which would signal how much of an emotional response the advert evoked. And this leads me on to the slightly creepy side of Google, starting with our reliance on it. On the 16th of August 2013, Google went down for 5 minutes, and in that time, global internet traffic went down by 40%. That is crazy. Or another example, the American country of Nicaragua accidentally invaded Costa Rica because of a Google Maps error. Maps said that Nicaragua owned a piece of land that was actually part of Costa Rica. So without realizing it was just a mistake on Google's end, the Nicaraguans, they actually went to Costa Rica and started planting their flags down. A few years ago, Google acquired a company called DeepMind, who is working on something they called the Neural Turing Machine, a computer built in a similar way to the human brain, combining human pattern recognition with the sheer ability of a computer to just crunch numbers. It can program itself. It's not all creepy though. Google is a company that likes to have a lot of fun, and one of the ways they do this is through Easter eggs. Their products and services are littered with them. If you search Google in 1998, it'll show you how the site looked back in the day. It makes you very glad we've moved on since then. If you search for Thanos and click the Infinity Gauntlet on the right hand side, you'll notice your search results fading away one by one until only 50% of them remain. Clicking again restores them. This will make a lot more sense if you've seen the Marvel films. Or alternatively, in Google Images, if you search for Atari Breakout, it'll actually allow you to play the game in your browser. This one's really unusual, but Google owns the domain name googlesucks.com, and not exactly an Easter egg, but you also might not have known that Google ignores the dots in Gmail addresses. If I sent an email to either of these two addresses, it would arrive at the same place. What about Google Maps then? Well, on one hand, over the years it's become a more and more impressive tool. You can now use it to virtually visit everything from the base camp of Mount Everest to the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. But it is also one of Google's favourite applications to mess around with. For example, if you ask for directions in certain parts of Scotland, it used to list the Loch Ness Monster as a travel option. Now, I've talked a lot about Google's quirky, jokey approach to a lot of things. This sometimes works really well for them, but it also sometimes backfires. On April 1st, 2004, Google announced Gmail, which was kind of crazy. It offered people a free gigabyte of online storage compared to the 2 megabytes that Hotmail did at the time. But the problem was, because they'd been running April Fool's pranks on this exact day every year, people thought Gmail was a joke. Another example, probably worse, was on April 1st, 2007. Google sent an email out to employees that a python had escaped and was loose in the facility. They were not joking. And there have been other fails. You might remember something called Project Tango. Around 2014, Google sensed the dawn of augmented reality, and they tried to build a system for phones to use it. The problem was that it was almost too ahead of its time. It required manufacturers to equip their phones with way too many sensors for a benefit that at the time barely extended beyond a novelty. The project was canned, and later converted to what a lot of Android phones use now, something called ARCore. And there was also Google Helpouts, which I honestly think had potential. It was a little bit like Fiverr, if you've ever heard of that. People who need help with something, they'd log on and they could talk to an expert who would try and solve their problem and pay them for their time. So if I fancied myself as a bit of a Wi-Fi expert, I could sign up as an expert and people could pay me to fix their Wi-Fi problems. One thing that Google does do really well though, is they're consistently trying to minimize their environmental impact. As of now, Google runs on 100% renewable energy. Every bit of energy that's used in their offices and their data centers, that comes from renewable sources. They also, instead of using traditional machinery, rent 200 goats to mow the lawns of their Googleplex headquarters. They encourage workers to ride bikes around the campus, and it's one of the few places in the world where none of these bikes are actually locked to anything. You just pick up the nearest one you find, ride it to the building you want to go to, and leave it there for the next person. I'm not completely sure it's paid off. They apparently lose up to 250 bikes per week because of their liberal approach. Now, just before my favourite Google nuggets, what about their logo? Well, it's changed a fair bit since launch. Their first iteration, in my honest opinion, is pretty highness looking, but they quickly swapped it out for a more modern approach. I do like the concept of having mostly primary colors, red, green, and blue, with the addition of yellow to show that Google doesn't just follow the rules, it changes them. You also might not have realized that for some time now, the E in the Google logo has been slightly rotated, again, just to show that they like to be unconventional. Oh yeah, and the company's motto, literally until a few years ago, was just "don't be evil," which they then swapped out to probably a safer move, "do the right thing." And finally, my top 5 miscellaneous Google facts. When they were just starting, the two co-founders, they rented a garage from a woman to work in. Pretty standard beginning for a big tech firm. We've heard it all before. But, as it turned out, this woman was Susan Wojcicki, who would actually end up becoming the CEO of YouTube. Google helps to fund Calico, a biotech company built to try and fight death itself. You might already know that Google is owned by a company called Alphabet. The funny thing about them though is that when they found out that alphabet.com was already taken, they decided to go for a URL of abc.xyz. That's awesome. One of the company's lifelong missions from very early on was to scan every book in existence, turning fading paper into an everlasting online record of everything ever written. It's quite a nice idea, but they ran into a bit of a problem trying to do it. To start with, it was running well. Literally truck after truck of books would arrive at Google's head offices, they would scan them and then return them to libraries. But about 25 million books in, authors and publishers started turning around and being like, "What are you doing?" Whilst Google thought their scanning was harmless and considered fair use for the purposes of education, the writers thought otherwise. Google's records, they were never destroyed, just banned. So somewhere in the vaults of Google are 25 million books that no one is allowed to read. And finally, I find this one pretty funny. There was a point when Google offered to sell their company to Yahoo for just $1 million. Yahoo said no, and now Google is worth about 300,000 times